We're doing this journey through Jewish philosophy, and last week we began our series by looking at the first great contributor really to the whole Jewish philosophic tradition, and that of course was Philo in the 1st century CE. And I just want to remind us, because it's very important to understand, especially for those joining us for the first time today, but those who were with us last week, and that is to remind ourselves that Jewish philosophy is effectively a reactive exercise. Philosophy is the pursuit of things that we can know about the world through the mind and through reason and through logic. And the Jewish people who have relied for the most part on revelation, how they can integrate those particular challenges that come from the general philosophic tradition. So that's important to remember about Judaism's philosophic tradition being, for the most part, a reactive one. We actually don't have any systematic philosophic contribution after Philo for nearly the next 800 years. We're going to open our chapter today in the middle of in the early part of the 900s, and Philo is living in the early part of the 1st century. So there's nearly 800 years between them. And it's not like in that time that Jewish people weren't thinking about issues. It's not like they weren't busy. We were producing the Talmud, 2 Talmuds in fact, Midrash, an entire genre of wisdom literature. We were the progenitor of 2 world religions. We were fighting a range of intellectual challenges from Christianity through Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, Neoplatonism. All of these things were occupying our mind, but there was no systematic attempt to sit down and try and write the basic philosophic ideas behind Judaism. It just wasn't something that was challenging the Jewish mind at that point intellectually. However, I don't know if you heard about it, but in the 7th century, the whole of world history really underwent a huge upheaval with the rise of Islam. That's not the total focus of our talk today, but it does change a lot of things for the Jewish world, since the Jewish world was pretty much found itself at the center of the Islamic world. And Muslim scholars, after a while, in the middle of the 8th century, we see the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate and their emphasis on creating a culture of learning and of wisdom. As you famously know and learnt at school, it was the Arab Islamic philosophers of the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries who carried over all of the texts and learning from the Greek world, from antiquity. The Greek philosophers and so on were translated into Arabic, and whereas the West had kind of fallen into a dark ages, it was the Arab world that carried forward the light of learning, so to speak. And as you can imagine, after a while, Islamic thinkers are going, how do we sort this out? On the one hand, we've got all of these incredible truth realizations and mind realizations that come to us from the Greek philosophers, but on the other hand, we've got the Quran, we've got Allah, who's given us this whole truth. How do these 2 truth systems match up? How can they be integrated? And so we see the rise of various Islamic philosophical schools, which, like Jewish philosophy, were for the most part reactive to the consequences of philosophy, and we call those early schools of Islamic thought come under a broad name called Kalam. Kalam means that particular stage of Islamic philosophy where it was struggling with the issues reconciling the core revelations of Islam and all of this Greek philosophical thinking that they were transmitting. Now, at some point in the 9th century, in the 800s, it soon becomes, and actually, I'm now going to share a graphic with you because I'm going to show you what we're going to talk about today for the next short while. Now, this particular graphic shows you what we're going to talk about today. This looks a bit probably overwhelming for some of you that are not familiar with the Gaonic period. Now, those of you who sat with me for the class I did for the museum on Monday, where we looked at this period in detail, or who've listened to my course recently, the 3-part course in the Gaonic period, will know what's going on here. But we're going to look today at the figure of Sa'adja Gaon. And you can see where Sa'adja Gaon fits in the early part of the 10th century. He's sitting between two of the last great Gaonim, Amram Gaon, who basically invented the Siddur, and Rav Hai Gaon, who's regarded as the last of the great Gaonim of this incredible period of the Gaonim. And Sa'adja is sitting there. He's a contemporary with the great philosopher Al-Farabi. You can see that things are just about taking off in Spain. So we're kind of, Surah, the great academy in Babylonia, Surah has undergoing a revival. But Sa'adja is kind of like its last meteoric blast. And we don't really have too much time to go into the biography of Sa'adja Gaon himself. Those of you who know a little bit about it will no doubt be impressed, as Sa'adja was impressed, as everybody since Sa'adja has been impressed. Basically, a massive, massive brain, born in Egypt and went to Babylonia as a young man, or maybe 25, 30 years old, and as soon as he arrives there, he's basically made the Gaon of Surah, which would be a bit like someone rocking up at the age of 30 to Oxford and suddenly being made the Chancellor of the university. Someone who overwhelms this period with their intellectual projects. Just prior to Sa'adja, there were several major intellectual challenges that were prodding the Jewish people. On the one hand, the Kalam, which was making its own progressions. The Kalam had basically got involved in the idea of apologetics on behalf of Islam towards philosophy, but they were coming to Jewish thinkers and they were saying to them, well, look, some of the things that you believe and that are written in your Torah and that are written in your Bible are not really philosophically tenable, and perhaps one of the most important of those is the fact that God in the Bible appears to have physical characteristics. God walks around, God has eyes, God has hands, and so on, whereas in the Quran it's much easier to reconcile that philosophically because God is a much more reified and abstract and incorporeal idea. So these are some of the challenges that were coming from Islam towards Judaism. There were other intellectual challenges. During the times of the Gaonim, we see the rise of the Karaite movement, who were very insistent on reading the Torah literally. And we had challenges from people like Chiwi of Balchi, who were writing very critical and skeptical books about Jewish thought. So one of Sa'adja's main projects, and one of the ones he's most famous for, is the establishment of a systematic theology of Judaism, a systematic way in which he could make sense of all the fundamental principles of Judaism and how they could appeal to the human mind. This might seem like something that we take for granted today, but Sa'adja was the first person to really lay this down in a systematic way in his famous book called Emunot V'Deot. And what identifies Sa'adja with the Kalam, and really he is effectively a Kalam thinker. He's Jewish, but many of his ideas, many of the structures of his thoughts are borrowed from Islam. But make no mistake, for Sa'adja, there was only really one source of truth, and that source of truth was the Torah. What he is trying to do is reground the whole of religious thinking on a basis that is compatible with reason and with philosophy. He was born in Egypt, but he had studied philosophy under several major teachers, both in Egypt and in the land of Israel, on his way to Babylonia. What identifies with the Kalam primarily, however, is the fact that the main discussion in Sa'adja's philosophical writings, as it was for the Kalam, the main discussion of philosophy is God. And what Sa'adja identified as the key point of any religion's claim to knowledge is the concept of revelation. But can the unique revelation of Judaism be reconciled with philosophy? Can it be reconciled with what we call reason, the products of the human mind? And for that purpose, Sarja wrote Emunot V'Deot, the book, a book of beliefs and opinions, Kitab al-Amanat wal-Ir Kadat, and in that book he does a very, very important analysis that I'm going to spend a few minutes on now, but it has a lasting thought. And that is, Sarja sat down and said, at the end of the day, let's work out, how do we know things? What is knowledge fundamentally comprised of? And he realized that there are two overarching ways in which we know things. One is through reason, and one is through tradition. And I'm going to share with you what that means for Sarja in this particular graph right here. Now, reason for Sarja involves three different modes of reason. One is sense input, so we know things from our senses. We see them, we feel them, we hear them, they happen to us, and that's one way in which we know things. The other is self-evident statements or truths, such as, for example, truth is better than lies, is a self-evident, truth is better than falsehood is a self-evident premise, especially if you're doing philosophical inquiry. And the other is logic, things that we work out via logistic syllogism and so on, and we arrive through a series of steps at logical outcomes. In contrast to that is the whole field of revelation. And revelation for Sarja doesn't just mean specifically the Torah as it's written, but it also includes all of the traditions that have come forth from Torah. And what that would include all the oral law traditions, the Talmudic and so on. But let's just focus for the most part on the text of the Torah itself. So it's very important that we understand that Sarja breaks down knowledge into this two-part system, because what Sarja is going to do is he's going to show how these systems must be compatible in any project of reconciliation between philosophy and Judaism. In other words, to understand Judaism itself is to understand the importance of reason. And Sarja's a famous kind of axiom is that in the acceptance of anything, reason and revelation must accord. Clearly, Sarja's key point is to try and show how this fourth level of knowledge, which we call tradition, and that includes the revelation of the Torah. We could call it revelation, we can call it tradition, because that's how we know about it. We know about it from tradition. This fourth level of knowledge, Sarja's job is to make that reasonable. Not that we believe it simply because there's a great big thunder and light show and a revelation, and we were told that that's what happened, therefore we must believe it, but that our belief system in that must be grounded in reason, the way that reason is grounded in revelation. It's not a vertical arrangement for Sarja, it's a horizontal arrangement. These two must agree, and Sarja's project is to make tradition reasonable, to set it up on a firm basis. Now, one of the ways, he does this in several ways, but one of the important ways he does this is in relation to the mitzvot and the commandments of the Torah. And Sarja, for example, points out that a lot of the commandments of the Torah make sense on their own. They are reasonable. Don't kill, don't steal. Those things are things the human mind could possibly arrive at by themselves. But there are many commandments where the reason is not apparent. But what Sarja wants us to do is to understand is that even those commandments of the Torah, such as the laws of kashrut, the dietary laws of the Torah, or many of the other ones that are not immediately accessible for reason, nevertheless have reasons behind them that the human mind is capable of understanding, and that in fact it should attempt to understand based on reason. So Saadia spends some of Emunot V'Deot in attempting to elaborate on what those reasons might be and how they can appeal to logic. So, and he goes through the 10 commandments as an example of the kinds of commandments that can emerge from the different ways in which we know things through reason. And that is an interesting aspect of Saadia's thought, but that's not the one I'm going to focus on right now. But it is interesting because that whole tradition that happens after the 10th century, where we're going to see that emerge in later thinkers, the attempt to understand the commandments of the Torah on a rational basis, not just on a revealed or blind obedience basis, really emerges from Saadia's distinction and his attempt to reconcile these two. But the real essence, the real engine of the book of beliefs and opinions of Sefer Emunot V'Deot is in relation to the topic of the various topics to do with God. So on the one hand, Saadia is going into the concept of divine uniqueness. What does it mean? What are all of these descriptions in the Torah about God? What are they actually doing there? And here's probably Saadia's key contribution. And it is to realize and to explain that, and I don't want anybody running out of the room when I say this, because it's a very, very shocking thought to a lot of people, that the Torah is not literal. The Torah is not a literal document. It can be interpreted allegorically. And we know that, says Saadia, because when the Torah talks about the eyes of God or the hands of God, it cannot be literal, because I have, on the one hand, a traditional notion that God is incorporeal, God does not have a body, but I also have an idea about that which conforms with reason. And Saadia explains to you, none of Aristotle's categories can apply to God. None of the incidentals or accidents that happen in relation to created things can be applied to God. God of necessity cannot have a body. These descriptions are modes of divine interaction. So when we talk about the hands of God, we're talking, or the arm of God, we're talking about the strength of God. When we talk about the eyes of God, we talk about the supervision of God on the world, but they are just descriptives of modes of interaction. They cannot be applied to God himself. God itself is beyond our understanding. Now, one of the issues that therefore comes out from there, and I'm just going to touch on this. It's a complex subject. I don't want to confuse people, but you could ask, well, how do we know that the tradition that we've got is the right tradition? And Saadia spends quite some time on this, because he relies on the prophets of Israel who have transmitted the tradition as having had a unique type of perception, and which Saadia calls their ability to perceive these modes of divine interaction through a mechanism called the kavod. And I'm going to show you a diagram of the kavod, and you'll realize, I made this last night. I know it's not perfect, but you'll realize that, what the kavod looks like, and the kavod means the glory, and it looks very similar to something we've seen before with Philo, who talked about the logos. The kavod speaks directly to the mind of the prophet in order to clarify what is true knowledge. There's many types of knowledge, but true knowledge of the divine is vouchsafed through the kavod, which is going to become a mechanism of Jewish medieval thought, because we need to understand why it is that the prophets of Israel were able to have this unique perception of the modes of God. But Saadia spends time explaining that. But the key point I want us to understand from this is the idea of allegory, that things are not necessarily literal. And I'm going to say another controversial point, and I'll say this now, is that I think if Saadia was around today, I don't think that he would have any problem with something like the theory of evolution, for example. He would tell you that if all of the scientific and logical and rational and reasonable evidence is pointing in a certain direction, and the Torah's description of creation doesn't seem to accord with reason, but it can be understood allegorically, then you understand it allegorically. It's not going to help anyone if you hold on to a blind literal faith in what the Torah says if it conflicts with reason. And we saw this with the descriptions of God's modes and all of the divine interactions and processes. So I don't think that there would be that kind of conflict that some people experience today between the Torah and science would not be an issue for Saadia. It's an issue for people today. And when it comes to creation, Saadia takes on board the most of the arguments of the Mutazilites, of the Kalam. He talks about the proofs of God, the usual proofs of the teleological argument from the Talmud about how if the world looks created, so there must have been a creator. But he also emphatically stresses that the world is created from nothing. Remember from last week, we talked about for Plato and even for Philo, it's possible that the world was created from pre-existent matter, but under no circumstances for Saadia. And this is something that Saadia Gaon establishes as an almost immovable pillar of subsequent Jewish philosophy, the concept of yesh me'ayin, the concept of the fact that the world and even time itself is created from nothing by God. And ultimately also Saadia is emphatic and lays down the paradigm for the future on the importance of free will. And that is that free will is something that you have. The conflict that's going to become very big in the Middle Ages about how do you have free will when God knows everything, not a problem for Saadia. He's aware of the argument, but he says God has foreknowledge of everything, but God's foreknowledge does not choose what you do. You choose what you do, not God's foreknowledge. He has it, but this is not a terribly satisfying answer to that question, but Saadia is aware of the question and lays down that whichever way you're going to approach it, you cannot deviate from the fact that you have free will. And why do you have free will? You have to have free will because otherwise there's no point. The commandments were given to people, and both rational commandments and even commandments that you can't yet understand with your reason were given. You're going to get reward for all of them. They're important to do because human beings need to earn their own reward in this world, and there would be absolutely no point to that if you did not have free choice. This very, very fundamental idea of Jewish theology laid down by Saadia in this systematic contribution. The other thing that Saadia talks about, and is really the first to talk about in a systematic way, is the concept of the soul. We know that already Plato had talked about the soul, and there are three levels to the soul, basically coming out of Platonic thought. There is your appetitive soul. In other words, that's the soul that goes around doing things that require just basic appetites, whether they are for food or other things. That's the That's the soul that wanders around the shopping centers and so on. And then you've got the emotive soul, that's the passions and all of your different aspects, whether it's courage or anger or love, and all of those things exist within your emotional framework. And then, of course, your soul has an intellectual faculty. This tripartite, this threefold division of the soul, is something that Saadia picks up on, because he finds an exact corollary in Jewish thought in the notion of the three modes that we talk about the soul of: nefesh, ruach, and neshama. The three terms that the Torah uses for the concept of soul as it is evolving in the biblical literature. And Saadia takes those and welds them to Plato's notion of the three parts of the soul. This is going to be immensely important going forward. It's going to have huge effect on Kabbalistic thinking as well as Jewish philosophic thinking, so it's important. But Saadia, in any discussion about the soul, as with anything else, says it must accord with reason. For that, Saadia, for example, rejects the concept of reincarnation. Reincarnation doesn't make sense for Saadia. Reincarnation is going to come back into Jewish thought in Kabbalistic thinking in a big way. Reincarnation is a part of Jewish thought, but for a rationalist like Saadia Gaon, living in the 10th century in the Abbasid Caliphate, he's not into reincarnation. It doesn't make sense to him. What he is, however, emphatic about is the concept of the resurrection of the dead. And that is, at the end of days, everybody is going to be brought back to life. And Saadia makes this argument based on his argument about yesh me'ayin, his argument about something from nothing. Because if God is capable of creating the world from nothing, then then the problem of creating something that has already existed is not going to be an issue. It's much more difficult to create something that has never existed than something that has already previously existed. So he takes these foundational Jewish concepts, the idea of the resurrection of the dead as an essential belief of Judaism had already been discussed by the Talmud. So Saadia can't reject that, but what he does is he takes that concept and he grounds it on reason. And therefore, let's just, to summarize again, the major contributions of Saadia Gaon. And I've gone through them very, very quickly, so I just want to go over them again. And that is that there is knowledge that we acquire through reason, and there is knowledge that we acquire through tradition. And those two things must accord if I'm to accept them as part of the way I see the world. It doesn't mean I can reject things I don't understand. If I'm told by revelation or tradition about certain things and I don't understand them, that just means I do not yet understand them. But Saadia tells you you can. There is a pathway of reason that leads to the understanding of everything in tradition. So the fact that you can't understand it doesn't mean you reject it. But if it conflicts with reason, if it conflicts with logic, such as, for example, what I was talking about before, the idea of reincarnation. Saadia's basic problem with reincarnation, by the way, was that he seems to be very concerned with when he wakes up at the end of days and the resurrection of the dead, who are you going to be married to? Seems to be a big problem for him. Not just that, but then you've got the other problem of exactly who are you? So he rejects that because he doesn't have to accept it because it conflicts with his reason. We talked about the fact that reason and revelation must accord. We talked about the fact that tradition is a guiding force. Maybe I didn't talk about this. Tradition is a guiding force for reason. So, because people could say, well, why did you need to put all those different types of commandments, the ones that we can understand through reason, the one we can't understand through reason? Why did God put them all in the same document? Sarja would argue because one guides the other. Tradition guides reason. It keeps it grounded in a proper perspective on the world, and at the same time, it allows us to move progressively from things that we can understand to things that we can't yet, but we accept from tradition. Tradition is also reasonable because, as Sarja argues extensively, because the way it's transmitted. And that is where that's where Judaism does its job very, very well, because of the historical dimension of Judaism that has allowed for these things to be transmitted throughout history. We talked about the notion of the kavod. The kavod, which is going to figure big in Jewish philosophy, is the transmitter of true knowledge that comes to the prophets of Israel so that they can discern that the knowledge that they are acquiring in order to express the modes of divine interaction with the world are correct. So you can see that in every single facet of Jewish thinking, Sarja is not just going, oh, I've got to believe this because I'm told it by the Torah or because I'm told it by the Talmud. He's putting everything through this mill of philosophy and reason to try and explain why it makes logic sense. I mean, I should point out to those who are wondering that, of course, many of the arguments of the Kalam, and we can include Sa'adeh in the broad category of Kalam thinkers who are at this particular time in the 9th and 10th centuries trying to take revealed religion and set it on a groundwork of reason, mostly for the purposes of apologetics, because Sarja's basic project is to resolve Judaism with its intellectual challenges, so that whether that is with Islam or whether that is with the accusations that are coming from elsewhere in the Jewish world, then we have to realize that many of those presuppositions of the Kalam were completely destroyed in the even during Sarja's time. Sarja, as I showed you, is a contemporary of Al-Farabi, and Al-Farabi is really a very different type of philosopher who is not necessarily using God as his initial premise, but in fact the whole notion of being in the world is much more similar to later Aristotelian philosophies, and he's destroying a lot of the Kalam arguments for reasons that I'm not going to go into now, obviously. But we should also be aware that with great respect, a lot of Sarja's philosophy was deconstructed by the Rambam, by Maimonides, a couple of centuries later, who doesn't really talk about Sarja so much by name, but that type of thinking, which is grounded in apologetics. And one of the great problems with it is that it can be applied to any religion, and that it doesn't. And it also is based because by the time you get to Maimonides, you've already gone through another couple of centuries of philosophical development, and many of the ideas of Greek philosophy are starting to be weeded out. While when Sarja's sitting reading philosophy, he's not reading philosophy that, when he's reading Aristotle, for example, he's not really reading Aristotle. He's actually reading a cholent of Aristotle and Plato and Neoplatonic thinking, the whole project of sorting out what exactly was Aristotle saying, and that massive difference that we're now aware of is even evolution over the next couple of centuries. So Maimonides, the Rambam, is coming from a far, in a way, more advanced and sophisticated philosophical position than Sarja was. But even Maimonides acknowledges, of course, that the groundwork laid by Sarja Gaon is essential to the ongoing project of thought and of Jewish philosophy, because he, on the one hand, is the first systematizer of Jewish thought, and on the other hand, his emphasis on the compatibility of Torah Judaism with reason and with philosophy. So I just wanted to go over, I know that I've gone on a whirlwind through Saaja's thought, but I wanted to grasp its essence. Of course, next week I'm going to just maybe fill in some gaps in relation to Neoplatonism and so on, and we're going to just look at a kind of a parallel project inside Jewish thought. But the answer to, is there a Jewish rationalist theology? The answer is yes. There are many, many people today, some of them even thinkers in the Jewish world, who haven't really progressed beyond Saaja, because Saaja's world and Saaja's worldview is enough for them. But we're going to see in the weeks that come that we need more. And yet Saaja Gaon's contribution to the foundations of Jewish philosophy are absolutely essential. I thank you for listening to that. I've got a question. So we'll just take one more minute. I've got a question. Oh, I see. But in relation to what I said of the soul. So obviously, the question is which is which. When I said nefesh, ruach, neshama, which parts of the soul are they? So the nefesh, this, by the way, is an incredibly enduring insight of Saaja's. It's amazing. The nefesh is the appetitive soul. So that's the one that breathes, that eats, that does the things the body does. It has its animal lusts and its animal appetites. That's the nefesh. The ruach is the emotive or passionate framework of the soul, and neshama is the intellectual one. It's the neshama that is going to apprehend the divine, whether it is through revelation or through reason. And so, obviously, Saaja's book, Sefer Emunot Vedeot, has been translated to those who want to look at it. There are many people who studied Saaja very fruitfully and found a great many things to discuss and talk about. But I can't emphasize enough how important that realization about the literality of Torah. Remember that Saaja is also fighting the Karaites who are arguing for literal interpretations. Islam and the whole concept of Quran, the whole concept of literality is surrounding Saaja. There are the challenges of coming from philosophy, coming from a great range of areas. And so Saaja's determination to make the Torah amenable to reason and to philosophy is a contribution of enduring importance. So thank you for listening to that. And I hope I will see you as we continue this whirlwind journey next week.